right, a great big welcome to all you intrepid Herle Burlyites out there. We've got a hell of a show for you today, but before we get there, I want to give you an update on both the power outage here at Air Quotes Media Worldwide Headquarters in Denholm, Quebec, and my general state of hygiene and cleanliness. The updates are these. If you're a Daily Curse of Politics listener, you know the storm hit us pretty bad up here, but the power's back as of last night, so we can get this pod out to you in good quality. And yesterday, I was able to take my first hot shower in 5.5 days when I flew back to Toronto for our Curse of Politics live event. And because I spent about 45 glorious minutes in there, and a loofah was involved, I'm still relatively clean today, which my house guests, Edmonton Hurleys, appreciate. I know you all enjoy some detailed shower talk, Herle Burlyites, and I'm so goddamned here for it. All right, today on the pod, we have Ryan Jespersen with us, ostensibly recently showered also, and the host of his own live daily streaming show, Real Talk, covering news, politics, and pop culture. He's a phenomenon in Alberta with a huge and devoted listenership. And the best part is, Ryan built it from the ground up, figured out the technology, hired staff, secured sponsors, created his own promotions, all after getting fired from his previous gig at CHED, which all sounds pretty darn familiar to me. Today we're going to talk about what else? Jason Kenney stepping down, Rachel Notley maybe stepping up, the potential future for the Conservatives in Alberta, and the general state of the province in Albertans as they look toward the future. We'll probably throw in a couple other things too. Ryan, super glad you were here with me today on the Herle Burly. You've had me on your show. I'm grateful that you came back to mine. A fellow show builder and audience earner out there. Great to see you.
Hey, well, it's great to be here. It's an honor to be asked, and it's nice to be sitting in the other chair, so to speak.
Hey, listen, do you have a dog in this Battle of Alberta fight?
Oh man, do you have background on what you're asking me to talk about right now, or did you walk into this innocently?
I'm walking into this innocently.
Okay,
I'm really walking into it innocently.
So this is where people like to try to pin me to the floor. This is where people try to nail me down because I'm a born and raised and a very proud Calgarian, right? For the first 24 years of my life, who then went on to kick off his mainstream media career in Red Deer and ultimately accept opportunities to move north to our provincial capital of Edmonton, where things really started to happen, where I started to host events, where I started to build my name as the host of a television show called Breakfast Television back in the day, and ultimately where the Edmonton Oilers hired me to be their in-game host, the Jumbotron hype guy for 7 years. And so I'm a born and raised Calgary Flames fan who hated but respected the hell out of Wayne Gretzky and ultimately ended up working for the team and, of course, cheering for the Edmonton Oilers to win the Stanley Cup for the last 7 years, which I'm not sure if you heard, David, but they did not during that stretch. I'm now raising a son, and we're soon to have a second. It may actually happen midway through this podcast recording, at which point I'll have to bail. Our children are being raised as Oilers fans. Exciting. And so I happen to be hosting gatherings here in Edmonton for the Oilers Cup run, so it's better for my bottom line. It's better for my pocketbook if the Oilers win. If the Flames were to win, I would have no problem cheering them on into the third round. So I'm one of these evasive. Are you seeing a career in politics for me? Maybe down the line.
Yeah, like Hillary said, I cheer for both the Yankees and the Red Sox. I don't think so. So yeah, I mean, and nobody believes, and I'm hearing about it from like my cousins and my brother, and all of like family members that are like, plant your flag, take a stance. And so I did, which will probably earn me consternation in my hometown for the rest of my life. But someone approached me on Twitter, just a random person, a follower of mine on Twitter, which I appreciated. They said, "Hey, listen, let me make this easy for you." They said, "Why don't I take the Flames? Why don't we bet $100 on a charity of the winner's choice?" Sort of handed it to me on a silver platter. I said, "I'll take the Oilers for 100," and so charities will benefit. But yeah, I guess I planted my flag. Damn it. I'll hope for the Oilers to win this one, David. There you go. Big game tonight.
You didn't think it was going to be a 4.5 minute answer, did you?
I did not think it was going to be a tortured, emotional thing. No, I didn't. I didn't mean to probe into your psyche hard that
well,
early.
I suspected you might. I didn't know it would be about hockey, but I suspected I'd get called to the carpet in at least one context. So here we are.
How did you get to Real Talk? Since I was rude enough to mention your firing in my intro, maybe you could tell us the backstory of all that. How did you get to have this show?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very relevant, and I don't mind talking about it. It was a great run on 630 Ched, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have been there, and they let me roam around with a very long leash, and I was hired under a mandate to, I wasn't fired out of television. I left. Of my own accord with this opportunity to go do talk radio, which I'd wanted to do for a long time. I always thought I'd do talk when I was 50 or 55 and kind of have a nice, 10, 15 year, sort of wrap to the public facing part of my career. But it worked out a little bit earlier than I suspect. And so in my mid 30s, I had that opportunity. And so I went there, and they told me as they approached me, and we had several meetings, obviously, that they were looking to get that radio demographic younger and a little bit more. I mean, I'm about to use a word that's become so supercharged right now. It used to be attached to the word conservative, but they were looking to get their audience a little more toward progressive, and they figured that I was their guy in Alberta. And that was kind of the audience I had built with breakfast television. Our audience was up 400% in the TV ratings. And so, they wondered if I could maybe do the same. I don't want to say resurrect. I'm giving myself a lot of credit, but be a bit of a shot in the arm for this legacy brand, this heritage brand. I mean, 630 Ched is talk radio in the province of Alberta. And to be in that 9 to noon time slot where legends like Dave Rutherford had been. I mean, Dave had an amazing run, and he and I politically a little bit different for sure, but cut from the same cloth with regards to curiosity around how people feel, and putting our finger on the pulse, and different styles and all that. But boy, to be able to have a chance to do that 9 to noon time slot was a huge honor and very exciting for me, and we had a great run. 6 years. It did a lot of cool things that I'm really proud of, and did build the audience. I mean, the ratings were stronger than they'd been in a long time. And, the show was sold out. I'd mention that from time to time, and our sales team asked me to please stop suggesting the show was sold out. They couldn't sell more advertising, right. but it was good. And had a great team there, and many people there that I still love and respect very much. But a big part of, my career at that point, and sort of where these stars were aligning. My first show was January 12th of 2015. So, at that point, Jim Prentice was trying to salvage the PC brand, which had been battered and bruised by, sort of a reputation of entitlement and high spending and a lack of accountability. Premier Alison Redford's time with the airplanes and the Sky Palace, and so Prentice comes in from Ottawa essentially to try to lead the PC's in calls an early election. I don't think your audience needs to be reminded of how this story went, but there I was 4 months into this new gig, and this 44-year reign, this progressive conservative reign, comes to an end, and Rachel Notley takes her NDP from 4 seats to 54 seats overnight. Not to discredit the campaign, it was an election that was more against something than it was for something. And so then the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, knocks off Stephen Harper several months later in the federal election. And we've got these tectonic shifts in the political landscape, and it's very good for talk radio. But it's also very interesting and a wake-up call for me with an audience that is traditionally older, white, male conservatives, which also describes me and my family and my friends and the circle I grew up in. I'm not saying that in a way to denigrate people. That's just the reality. And so when I would get the new premier on, or when I would get senior cabinet ministers, or when I get the prime minister in studio on 2 occasions like I did, it was like I was an apologist, right? It was like I was a traitor to the province. It was like I was trying to, rub something in the faces of this radio audience. And there was this really interesting dynamic that was created where a portion of the audience, and I would see it every day on our text line. It was like this stock ticker in front of me that would provide live analysis. And I'm trying to remember, David, what's your profanity on this? I can say what I want, right? Can I?
Oh, please
say real words.
Oh, please.
Yes. So I'd show up. I'd show up for work, and I'd be like, what's up, Ched Nation? We got a great show in store. And the first message that would pop up would be like, "You dumb asshole," and then it would just go from there. And some of them would be like, "Jespo, it's amazing that we're talking about pride on 630 Ched. We've never heard people talking about pride on 630 Ched." And then the next one would be like, sort of something horrific about trans people, or something really awful about whatever. You get the idea. And so while we were building our numbers, there was this almost like a turnover that was happening that was difficult to navigate. And you have to be somewhat unapologetic as a provocateur, right? It is a purveyor of opinions and talk radio. And then things, started to happen. 2017, Jason Kenney came in to try to unite the conservative parties, which obviously he did. And at the beginning, I wouldn't say that I was friendly with Kenney, but we had no beef. I mean, I grew up in Southeast Calgary. My parents would host fundraising muffin mornings in our home in Southeast Calgary, Mackenzie Lake. Jason Kenney was there. I first met him when I was a teenager, when he was a young MP, and had no beef with him. But I was committed to tough interviews. And also I felt like I was speaking on behalf of a significant portion of the population that was curious to know what he was going to do on certain files and what his position was going to be on some of the more social stuff, so to speak, some of the more, ethical or more public interest type stuff, as opposed to simply jobs, economy, and pipelines. And long story short, it got to a point where my colleague at the time, Charles Adler, and I, participated in a series of conversations, me and him one night, and then the night to follow, him and Jason Kenney, and what went on to become, I think, one of the most significant and, in my mind, iconic and impressive political interviews in recent Canadian history. I mean, it was a master's class. It was unbelievable. Adler just tying up and twisting up this veteran politician into knots. And I remember that after my conversation with Chuck and then the Kenney interview the next night I heard from someone who is still a senior staffer in the Kenney Premier's office right now that said, "You've done your last interview with Jason Kenney." And that was kind of the beginning of the end. And I kind of knew it. Election night 2019, Big Four building down in Calgary, they had to call in extra bodies to stand in front of the global television set. I was there because we were getting heckled and people were throwing things at me. I mean, it was really bad. And, I was a self-identifying small P, small C progressive conservative at the time. You would have thought I was a Greenpeace activist up there, the way I was getting treated by this Calgary crowd. And then what happened, David, ultimately, I mean, the real story, that's the real story, but the side story that most people understand to be the only story was kind of a kerfuffle I got into with an Edmonton city councillor who just got his ass whooped in Edmonton's recent municipal election. He wanted to be mayor, and the people of Edmonton said, hell no. But me and him got into a bit of a tiff, and then his staff did, and he did a pretty impressive job of smearing my comment, a benign comment, as racially fueled, which of course it wasn't. And I described that as the tuna, the yellowfin tuna that nipped my heel as I was swimming in the ocean. But regardless, it got me bleeding. And then the sharks could smell it and sense it, and they started to circle. And ultimately, they took me down. And it was my words that got me fired, and I stand by those. I've described it as a public hanging with a lack or in the absence of public outrage. I had a lot of public support, and it was important to us. I knew that there was this community that felt like their radio show had been canceled. They felt like their radio show had been attacked. And this community, I was pretty confident that if we could build something that was credible and quality and daily and live streaming and easy to find, that they would come with us, and they did. And we've been doing it ever since November 23rd of 2020.
It's a big success. So it's a big shot across the bow of all those people that were after your ass. This podcast only happens at the intersection of our devoted audience and technology. In other words, Herle Burlyites and accursed, thank you for being you. And internet, thank you for the hookup. I appreciate the goddamned hell out of you. I guess I thought I should throw down for the internet because clicking wherever we want to go is now just second nature for most of us. It's not that way for all Canadians, though. Many of us need help getting that connection. There's a digital divide in this country, and our presenting sponsor, Telus, is working on a number of ways to bridge it. Their Internet for Good program is one of those ways. For low-income families who are struggling, for seniors living on fixed incomes, for youth aging out of care and people with disabilities. It offers reliable, high-speed internet access at the lowest cost possible. Opportunities never happen in a vacuum. Internet for Good means individuals and families can get the information they need and stay connected to loved ones and friends. Since the program began, over 31,000 households in BC, Alberta, and Quebec have come online with it. 11,500 were added just last year. And Telus means to help 75,000 households access high-speed internet by 2025 with Internet for Good. Herle Burlyites, they'll do it because they're not afraid to speak those commitments into existence and then measure objectives against actions. That's what makes them accountable. It's all part of Telus's ESG commitments I've been talking about here these last few weeks. Environmental, social, and governance. How they put the well-being of their customers, communities, and the planet first. Read more about it in their sustainability and ESG report at telus.com/sustainability. So let's move from that. Person losing their job to Jason Kenney losing his job. What happened to Jason Kenney? Where did it go wrong for Jason Kenney? Like 3 years in office, and he's run out. I mean, we're sitting here in Ontario, and Doug Ford's cruising to re-election, for God's sake. And, I bet if you had asked Jason Kenney at any point, he would tell you that he was a far more sophisticated political operator than Doug Ford is. And yet here he is out of office after 3 years. What happened to him?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just people figured him out. That might be it. I mean, he campaigned and he's a great campaigner and a great organizer. He's a formidable organizer, obviously, and he's just not a great leader. And one doesn't necessarily begat the other. And I've had some interesting interviews, obviously, on my show on Real Talk. We've been having roundtables and panels and having these exact conversations with some people that have been senior staffers with Kenney, like Blaise Bomer, who is his campaign director, his director of communications for a couple of years. And other people. Erica Barudis came on. She was the founding president of the United Conservative Party, and all of these people have made the point that Jason Kenney was extremely effective. I mean, David, as if I'm telling you anything you don't know, extremely effective as a lieutenant for Stephen Harper, but that doesn't make him a visionary. That doesn't mean he's Peter Lougheed, right? And he'd come in 2017 and try to, set the tone, and it was effective. Like he didn't try to unite these long warring conservative parties, the Wild Rose Party and the Progressive Conservatives. He did unite them, and he did win two leadership races back to back. He was the first ultimately premier-elect in Alberta's history to earn more than 1 million votes. He earned 1,050,000. Rachel Notley, I think just about 700,000. And then, the Alberta Party, this fledgling Alberta Party, in third with about 170,000 for perspective. So, he did accomplish that, and he convinced people in this sort of town by town tour of this blue pickup truck that he was driving, this Dodge Ram, that he was the people's premier. And they've even convinced, you've probably heard about this, he's still doing it despite his resignation. He's still doing a show on my former station on Saturdays called Your Province, Your Premier. And, he convinced people that he was kind of that guy. And he got exposed for that a whole bunch of times, right? Like he got busted for, he's driving his RV around rural Alberta, but they found out that, he was, in this day and age, you can't do that. Everyone has camera phones. Everyone has Instagram. He got busted. He was on the patio at the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel wearing room slippers with his hat backwards, sipping a coffee. Like whatever. The premier's at the Banff Springs Hotel in slippers, and he's hopping in the RV a kilometer away from the town and driving it in. Like, you can't pull that off. I mean, you saw the gaffe just the other week, talking about how the provincial government's lifting its 13, 14 cents a liter gas tax, which is I think, welcomed by some Albertans right now. The price of gas is wild. At the same time, it's hurting provincial coffers, so you can have a nuanced conversation about that. But you saw what happened. Everybody saw what happened. He couldn't even get the nozzle into the gas tank. This isn't a guy that pumps his own gas. I used to joke on the radio station. I said, let's put $1,000 up for charity and let's see who can change a tire faster, me or the premier. Let's go. I like my chances. I mean, he's just not that guy. He's not the guy that knows how to saddle a horse. Nor am I. But he tried to come across like that. And I think that people figured out that it was patronizing and that he was really looking out. And this is what I talked to Charles Adler about that night. That he had people that he was and is essentially answering to. And these are the people that got him in and that raised a lot of support, these religious groups, these pro-life groups, a lot of the social conservatives that you need to secure if you're going to bring these two parties together. And ultimately, it came back to bite him in the ass. He had real problems around culture. His premier's office is being sued right now by a former staffer, Ariella Kimmel, and there are other names on that suit. There have been questions around the culture of drinking in the legislature behind closed doors. The minister of Devin Dreeshen, pretty prominent, and I take no joy in that. I've actually had an opportunity off the record to speak with the former minister about it, and I actually quite appreciated his perspective, and I'm not taking shots at him, but there is a fact that the reputation was out there. I mean, this is a guy, Jason Kenney, that talked about bringing decorum back to the Alberta legislature, and then in his first session showed up with earplugs to hand out to all his MLAs while the official opposition NDP was trying to argue something in the House. So, I mean, I think people just ultimately figured him out, and there's probably a lot that goes into it. There's sort of the being pulled from both directions during the COVID struggle over the past 2 years. Not easy for any political leader, obviously. But you've got Jason Kenney, especially with this so-called big tent Conservative Party. If you do believe that is indeed what the UCP is, and you've got people that believe he's doing not enough on the COVID file, and there's people that believe he's doing far too much. And how do you please both masters? You can't, and he couldn't.
Right. I've had this theory. I mean, I think Jason has spent his life pretending to be a lot of things.
Yeah.
But his big accomplishment was persuading people that he was an Albertan, but he isn't. And I have a theory that he didn't understand the province very well. I mean, I think if you look at anybody who's ever been premier of any province in Canada, I doubt anybody has ever cumulatively spent fewer minutes of their life in the province that they were premier of, between his background in Saskatchewan and then his adult life in Ottawa. So when he came back, and to me, I'm a former Saskatchewanian who lives in Toronto. It looked like a caricature. The big blue, whether it was a Ford F-150 or Dodge Charger.
I should say I'm sponsored by Dodge. I should point out it is the Dodge Ram. Yeah,
a Dodge Ram. I mean, it all seemed like an affectation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just people are going to figure that out. Right. I mean, one example, I think probably one of the more explosive stories. There have been a few, obviously, outside.
But to go to go to the understanding of Alberta, let's bring it to something real. Did he actually think Albertans would be okay with coal mining the Rocky Mountains?
I was just going to say, there's not a chance. Who do you think you're dealing with? You even want to talk about, I mean, even if you want to get real about this for a second, and I'm not saying these are the only people affected. There are Indigenous communities that would have been affected by this. There are agricultural producers that would have been affected by this with regards to the selenium into the water and all of the, I mean, there's so many reasons why it's just a boneheaded idea. But you think that wealthy ranchers in southern Alberta are going to be thrilled about this, and you think you can afford to lose wealthy ranchers in southern Alberta? When you have Terry Clark and Paul Brandt and Corb Lund and Brett Kissel and every notable country, I've forgotten and omitted a whole bunch, and my apologies to the talented performers coming out of Alberta. But when you've got these country western singers banding together to start singing about your decision to allow mining and to fast track it and to bulldoze it through, then you're in trouble. And I think that sent a really clear message, because all of a sudden it wasn't like we're going to take, one thing that Doug Ford and Jason Kenney had in common is they both, I think, used the exact same phrase. If I remember correctly, they both talked about putting draft curriculum through the shredder. And the NDP had been perpetuating or continuing, let me say, a curriculum review that was initially kickstarted by the Progressive Conservatives before them. And Alberta's curriculum is in desperate need of a rewrite, as all curriculum is every 30 years or so. You kidding me? It should be done every 5. And so anyway, he said this ideologically left-leaning social justice, curriculum that the NDP has been trying to force on the ideological NDP has been trying to force on Albertans. We're going to put it through the shredder. We're going to start from scratch. And he appoints Chris Champion to quarterback this curriculum review. I mean, this guy's a residential school denier. This is a guy that has suggested that because Indigenous kids were smiling on a playground apparatus, that there was no evidence of abuse at residential schools. This guy's a disaster. But Kenney was able to ram that through and kind of get away with it, at least to a certain point, because he could remind people that these were the left-leaning, unionized teachers that his government was pushing back against. And it was the same thing in going tough on negotiations with nurses and doctors, and in talking about canceling a $600 million super lab, which probably would have come in handy. Let me not say that. It wouldn't have been built through the pandemic, but you get the idea. There's more impetus, I think, for for health security and for homegrown research facilities now. We're understanding that, and vaccine development and what the federal government was criticized for. I won't get too off track. But again, in canceling or going tough on some of these healthcare files, who are you going tough against? Unionized nurses and high-earning doctors and the elites, right? But once you started messing around with coal mining on the eastern slopes, there were no unions to crack on, right? There weren't sort of the traditional public service sector or those careers to crack on, the easy ones like education and health, where Alberta spends, tens of billions of dollars every year, obviously. And that one was huge. The coal mining one was, and it remains huge, by the way, because it's recently resurfaced. The story has that the Alberta government has not put on pause as much as it pretended it would. It's one of these kind of ones. I'm teaching my 6-year-old son right now, David, about integrity, and my grandpa taught me how to shake hands. He said, really sort of put your heart into it. He said, look the person in the eye and never let go first. And so I'm teaching my son this about shaking hands and what it means to do a deal. And his name's Wyatt. And he slyly looked at me the other day and he said, "Hey, Dad, do you know if you cross your fingers behind your back, you don't really mean it when you're shaking hands?" I said, "That's not integrity." I said, "That's not how our family works. That's not what you do when you're shaking hands." We kind of felt like that's what the Alberta government did on this coal mining thing. It was kind of like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, fingers crossed behind our back. And people found out that there has been exploration that's continued through these months where Albertans were being led to believe that everything was on pause. And so I can see this absolutely being dragged out as an election issue next year.
I don't know how many of you have ever seen the port of Long Beach in Los Angeles. It's a massive industrial center, a sprawling intake valve of the American economy. Thousands of container ships disgorge their cargoes into the port every year. And in these days of chaotic supply chains, it can also be a choke point. That's what was happening a few months ago, as a shipload of vital blood collection supplies and COVID tests was steaming toward Long Beach from Asia. Hospitals across the U.S. needed the supplies, but the Los Angeles port was too backlogged to handle the shipment. So the White House contacted our sponsor, CN, which happens to operate the Port of Prince Rupert in British Columbia and has the most extensive North American network of any major railway. The container ship changed course and headed north. CN, meanwhile, arranged to prioritize the cargo. The railway effectively cleared a route from Rupert to Chicago, where CN's intermodal team was waiting to unload and expedite delivery to the hospitals. Long story short, the medical supplies arrived at their destinations several days ahead of schedule. It required perfect cooperation among government officials, transfer terminals, transportation teams, and railway planners. And that is what happened. Simply put, no other railway could have provided as effective a solution, which is why the White House called on CN. I've said it here before, we've made it this far into the pandemic with our economy largely intact, thanks to thousands of dedicated CN railroaders. Without them, there would be no supply chains, period. So I want to talk about COVID for a second, because I think that it's got to be somehow at the bottom of illustrating some of the challenges that Kenney was trying to deal with both in his party and in the province. Because whatever else we can say about Jason Kenney, and I don't think either you or I are ever going to be invited to a birthday party, but whatever we can say about him, he's not an unintelligent person, correct?
No, he's a smart guy.
Smart guy. He's capable of absorbing information and being briefed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he would have had the same information about COVID and understood it that every other premier in Canada did. So where does best summer ever come from? And what does that tell us about what the pressures were on him or how decisions got made? Because what I'm really saying is he knew that was dumb. He had to know that was dumb. Why was he doing that?
I mean, you say we're making an assumption, right? Like he had to know it was dumb. Maybe he didn't. I mean, I know that this conversation's more about the premier, but I don't know what to call him. I mean, he is still the premier. I mean, he's resigned, but he's still the premier. So we'll call him the premier for now. did you see that, by the way? You know, Charles Rusnell, I don't know if the name rings a bell, but he's an investigative reporter. He's recently left the CBC to go out on his own, and he's contracting out investigative journalism, and he does just a great job with Jenny Russell, his partner, his professional partner. And anyway, so Charles quipped the other day, you know, this radio show I told you about is called Your Province, Your Premier. He quips, he says, well, what are we supposed to call the show now? And Jason Kenney's executive director of communications, of strategy and communications, Brock Harrison, who, you know, if I can say for a second and prove me wrong, that drove and poorly advised Danielle Smith and buried her political career, at least for now. Although that's an interesting one to follow, David. And then advised Andrew Scheer and lost an election as Andrew Scheer's director of communications, and then had another nice soft landing back down into Alberta, and is now advising the premier, who's just resigned. But Brock Harrison tweets back publicly, like not whoops, not an accident, not thought it was his burner account. Nope, from his blue checkmark account, he said, you know, he's still the premier, Charles, or did you need someone to explain this to you? And I'm kind of going, this guy is like Charles Rusnell, like, watch your tone, first of all, around Charles Rusnell, who has nothing to prove with regards to his intelligence or what he's contributed to public discourse or political accountability. And second of all, how about a little humility? How about a little grace? Like, your guy just resigned after getting a 51.4% grade, only a technical pass through his leadership review just 36 months or less after becoming the victor of the biggest election win in Alberta history. So, you know, to quote the late and some would argue great Jim Prentice, maybe it's time to look in the mirror with this premier's office. And this is an office that has been snide and snarky and condescending, an office that has bullied its critics since inception. Right? So best summer ever is, you know, Ben Harper, and I'm not taking shots at these guys. This is a fact. This is documented. They did it. I'm talking about it. Stephen Harper's kid, you know, Brock Harrison, the director of comms for the premier, and others, you know, with their glasses of whiskey and their cigars, posting their photos on their bikes. The party, the United Conservative Party, selling best summer ever hats on its website as a fundraiser. I mean, just rubbing it in the face of people who were still visiting family members in palliative care, in long-term care, in emergency care through plexiglass or on Facebook Live. I mean, David, there's been times where I have failed. And
they basically forced the stampede on people, right?
Well, they forced the stampede, arguably, on the stampede. I had some pretty interesting feedback off the record, and I won't betray anyone's trust, but from people tight and close with the Stampede board who are saying this is like, it's coming across like this is, the Stampede has lobbied the provincial government for this, but the Stampede, you know, anybody in Western Canada and probably across the country knows the significance of the Calgary Stampede and what it represents so much more. You remember central and southern Alberta's flooding in 2013 and the Stampede's campaign. I mean, the Saddle Dome still had water like 13 rows up. Right? Harvey the Hound, the Flames mascot, they found his floating head amongst the covered in mud. It became the symbol. Harvey's been devastated twice. Once when Craig McTavish, at the time the Oilers coach, ripped his tongue out, and the other time when he was found floating with the Southern Alberta floods. But you remember, David, the campaign that year for the Calgary Stampede was hell or high water, and it was like, we will not. Like the symbol of Calgary's resilience was that the Stampede would fucking happen no matter what. And that was the deal this year as well. And obviously it blew up in their face. And obviously the government lost some credibility and some public trust there. But still, there's this whole other faction. Like, David, I drove down to Calgary just a short time ago to visit my parents. And I drive past these billboards. And there's a billboard right now that says Jason Kenney has jailed more Christian pastors than China. And it's a reminder to people that Jason Kenney betrayed them. It betrayed the libertarian element. It betrayed the socially conservative element, the religious freedom group that wanted to be able to still congregate by the hundreds in the height of COVID outbreaks. The RCMP had to end up putting a big fence around a church just outside Edmonton because they wouldn't stop gathering. The pastor's in jail. They're bringing in other preachers. I mean, this was like really rough water to navigate and not easy for Jason Kenney at all. But I guess you would argue, I mean, who doesn't like the Stampede? Like, who doesn't? I mean, I asked the question rhetorically, but obviously they rolled the dice, and on that one they lost.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I've been watching the Ford government here, and they steadied themselves during COVID by basically listening to the professional healthcare advice. They got into trouble. Sometimes they didn't. There was some zigging and zagging to meet constituents, to meet stakeholder groups. But by and large, they stayed sort of in the acceptable sphere of how COVID was being managed in Canada. And they've benefited from that. And Kenney tried to outthink that virus and really cost him, I think.
Yeah,
but it also, to me, illustrates the pressure. I mean, this United Conservative Party. Okay, I've been saying things. You tell me how crazy this is. I think there's a more stable governing coalition in Alberta for the NDP than there is for the Conservatives. Because the NDP have to put together the major urban centers, and those two urban centers have a lot in common. The Conservatives have to put together the rural and Calgary, and those two places no longer have a lot in common.
I don't know if Edmonton and Calgary has a lot in common. I'm not convinced, actually, and I've lived almost 20 years in both cities. I love both cities, and Calgary, I mean, at least reputationally, although you know what the really strange thing is with Edmonton? Edmonton provincially is virtually a lock for the NDP. I mean, not to say there can't be conservative MLAs, and there have been. Some of them are personal friends of mine. There is currently one, Casey Madhu, who will not win if he runs again, although some have said he's flirting with the idea of seeking the leadership. I mean, I almost dare him to for our entertainment, but he's incredibly unpopular. This is the guy you may remember for your national audience, Herle. This was the guy while Justice Minister was pulled over by the police, allegedly for driving distracted on his phone, and he called the chief of police while he was the Justice Minister and Solicitor General to ask about it. Like, just not like. You might argue the political instincts are lacking a little bit. The point is to say that Edmonton could go entirely NDP next election and probably will. However, in the federal election, Edmonton has traditionally sent one new Democrat MP to Ottawa. That was Linda Duncan, and then Heather McPherson succeeded her in Edmonton Strathcona. So there was that one, and then Blake Desjardins, who's just an incredibly impressive young parliamentarian now in Edmonton Griesbach. He beat Carrie Diot, the former journalist, a conservative MP in the last election. So Edmonton now has two NDP MPs, but other than that, it's a conservative sweep. And so federally, Edmonton is very strong conservative, and provincially very strong NDP. And I've never really been able to reconcile that myself. Never really been able to figure that one out. Maybe you have some insights.
Well,
there.
don't you think it's because the federal election is not about internal Alberta issues? The federal election is about protecting Alberta's collective interests against a liberal federal government.
Yeah.
And so the whole province puts on a team sweater and says, we got to beat the Liberals because they fucking hate Alberta. When you get into a provincial election, you got everybody loves Alberta and there's no external threats. You're talking about what matters internally. To me, the provincial one's a more honest description of what people think about policy.
Yeah, I've seen people, and I've witnessed it many times with almost like spit coming out of their mouth, like, she sounds like a conservative. And then it's kind of like, I can't imagine the same person then ticking CPC on the federal ballot. Like, I don't know if it's two different factions, if it's two different groups. I don't know, but it's fascinating. Whereas Calgary, and Calgary sort of sees Edmonton as the government town, the union town, the blue collar town, the left leaning town, and Edmonton sees Calgary as more obviously white collar. Obviously undeniably more conservative. I mean, you look kind of at the mayoral races and what some of the issues have been about there. Although, how interesting, isn't it, that you've got two visible minorities and as the mayors of Alberta's two largest cities in Dr. Jody Gondek and Calgary and Amarjeet Soni.
But isn't that the point?
Stuff.
Isn't that the point, Ryan? Because these are now big cities. Like Alberta and Edmonton are big cities, and Calgary and Edmonton are big cities, and Calgary's been growing like crazy, and it is like most big cities. It's got a diverse population. It's got a whole bunch of cultures in there that never used to live in Calgary. And as a big urban city, people start to care about things like, transit and other big city things, which change the politics. Yeah, Conservatives don't do well. Conservatives don't do well in any large city in Canada outside of Alberta.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at really the at least the most recent, and I would say the two most recent municipal elections in Alberta that saw Don Iveson reelected for his final term as Edmonton's mayor over some challengers. Karen Leibovici was a strong challenger. You had who else ran a strong campaign that. I feel bad. I'm forgetting somebody. And then down in Calgary, they had Bill Smith, who was like the favorite. I remember I was at a Flames game in the Saddle Dome, and they had the Flames. They had like elect Bill Smith stuff going around the LED because, of course, they knew that they had that big arena deal debate to come up, which is still obviously a really contentious one in Calgary. And then now again with Jeremy Farkas, who was kind of this strong conservative candidate down in Calgary versus Jody Gondek, and it's like these elections have almost virtually been plebiscites on issues like the arena deal and transit. Like that's almost all this has been about. I mean, maybe there's been a little bit of talk about, mill rates and property taxes and that kind of stuff that typically comes up. But for the most part, it was like, which is what I do think a municipal election should be about, which is the vision stuff. What are your top priorities? And there was a candidate in Edmonton who she sort of made a shift and adjustment on the fly midway through the campaign, I think, to try to see a bump to get her into the top three contenders. She's a friend of mine. I don't mean any ill will here or to pile on her. It was a disappointing campaign for her, but Cheryl Watson, who's accomplished so many things in Edmonton, in Alberta, with innovation and tech and attracting talent and entrepreneurs, and she's whip smart. But she brought in a political advisor who's now advising Brian Jean, by the way. I always like to give the Herle Burly audience the inside track on this. Conservatives will know he was a former policy chief for the federal Conservatives, Vitor Marciano. And he joined Cheryl's campaign, and he said, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to make a bold proclamation that we would cancel, that when you're elected mayor, you're going to cancel Edmonton's West LRT line, which is a multi-billion-dollar massive project. The city's already bought blocks and blocks of land. They've knocked down houses. They've closed down businesses to make way for this big LRT line, and people all of a sudden sat there, and I saw it happen. I hosted mayoral forums. I fielded the questions from people going, how can someone that's forward thinking and talking about attracting families to work and learn and live here and innovation in the future and building cities threaten to cancel an LRT line to satiate this loud minority of people that just want to keep the property tax increase as low as possible? Not that that's not a thing, but that shouldn't probably be the top priority for a visionary, right? So it's been very fascinating to see how these municipal elections have gone as well.
Yeah. So what's after Kenney? I'm telling you, if I had been a Conservative member in Alberta, I think that Jason Kenney was a disaster as premier. But I would not have voted to kick him out as leader of my party if I thought he was going to be replaced by either Danielle Smith or Brian Jean. I call him Brian Jean on this show just to piss him off.
Yeah, but it's probably working, yeah.
Yeah. So these two people are midgets as far as I'm concerned. Danielle Smith should never be entrusted with a political party again after what she did to Wild Rose. So telling me that all this fighting, all this amalgamation of parties, splits, mergers, these are the only people whose names can keep coming up for a decade for Conservative leadership? Is these names? Nobody else?
I mean, the jockeying is happening right now. And what's really interesting is, I talked to Charles Adler about this a while ago, and we were talking about how when Ralph Klein got a 55%, earned himself a 55% leadership review, he stayed on for a while because he was still strangely immensely popular among the general population. So he was able to justify sticking around and maybe doing some legacy work, which is obviously what Jason Kenney is going to do right now. When Alison Redford was booted, essentially, it was 4 days from the time she resigned to the time that David Hancock was sworn in as Alberta's premier. I think the 13th premier, I think, irrelevant. And so, that was quick, and the body wasn't even cold. And so the question was, what does this mean for the United Conservative Party now? When is Jason Kenney leaving? One factor at play certainly has to be the visit of the Pope. Is coming to apologize for the residential schools, a papal visit for a strong Catholic like Jason Kenney. A lot of people think that that's probably one of the reasons why he's sticking around. And another one I think is to, for the legacy work, I think it's probably difficult for a guy like him. I'm not going to pretend to know him personally very well, or well at all, but I think it's probably difficult. He's not the type of guy that wants to go out with 51.4% and, don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. So I suspect
nobody does want to go out that way.
Nobody wants that. So they're going to, he'll do his best to remind Albertans that, you look at the messaging now and like I said, it may just be, sort of peacocking or whatever you'd call it, false bravado anyway. But, his team is talking about how Alberta, not Alberta's on its way back or Alberta can come back stronger. It's Alberta is back. And it's an interesting take when Calgary's experiencing the highest unemployment of any major Canadian city. There are a lot of reasons why you might think that that's a curious statement. I love Alberta. I'm proud to be from Alberta. I will always cheer for Alberta's success. But the fact of the matter is the messaging right now coming from the Premier's office is, I think that they want to remind everybody that things aren't as bad as a 51.4% would lead you to believe. Now, here's the interesting thing as well. There are some, including Adler, who don't believe that this resignation is going to mean anything at all. Rules have never gotten in the way of Jason Kenney's performances before or how he's approached politics. And a lot of people believe that with some time passing and with people's anger calming down and with people having had a say, you remember even with this leadership review, it was supposed to be in Red Deer in person and 15,000 people registered. And then all of a sudden the party changed it to a mail-in ballot and extended the deadline and started gaming or at least amending the rules to be more favorable for Jason Kenney's
They tried to rig it for Kenney, and they got it all the way up to 51%.
RCMP are still investigating the 2017 leadership run with the alleged kamikaze campaign and everything else. People's trust in Alberta right now is a little bit bruised with this guy. But the interesting thing, David, and I don't have the numbers or the source in front of me, but you can take my word for it or not, but I've been told that even with some internal party polling and some people just asking around anecdotally and otherwise that although Jason Kenney's resigned, he's still the most popular option to lead the party forward. So who's to say he's actually even going to leave?
Do you think he could win an election?
In Alberta? Yeah, I do.
Really? Okay, so you think if he managed to hang on or if he hadn't been deposed, that he had a chance to beat Notley?
Yeah, I do.
Why do you think that?
Because I don't think anything's inevitable in Alberta politics. It used to be so.
Well, of course, nothing.
It used to be so predictable, and I think that conservatives could have won even bigger landslides. From the time of social credit wrapping up, the Ernest Manning era sort of thing, all the way through till Jim Prentice, if more people had believed that their votes were important, because I think people just considered it to be a wash. That's not to say there weren't some decent official oppositions. The Alberta Liberals used to form a decently formidable opposition, and then of course the Wild Rose Party for quite some time. But PCs just took it for granted. Because they just won every election by a lot. It was wild, David. You look and it was normal for a progressive conservative to win their riding with 78% of the vote or 81% of it. Was geez, I can't even imagine running for another party. Looking at that uphill climb. Now, I think that Ms. Notley, Rachel Notley, was on my show just I don't know when this is going to be released, but she was on my show on Wednesday on May 25th, and I talked to her for a while about her vision for the future of Alberta. And it's former Environment Minister in Alberta, Shannon Phillips, who's an NDP MLA out of the hotly contested riding down in Lethbridge, referred to Jason Kenney just the other day as yesterday's man. They don't want to talk much about him. They don't want to talk much about the United Conservatives. The NDP has kept relatively quiet, at least on the UCP and on their disarray over the past while. They've just been letting the house burn. But they're starting to present their vision. And Rachel Notley is very likable, not with everybody. Some people are never going to like her. Some people don't like that she's an NDP representative. Some people don't like she's a woman, quite frankly. I saw a lot of that on the text line in my radio job. But I wouldn't say that it's a foregone conclusion. I think that, with regards to the Conservatives, if Jason Kenney or a new leader, I mean, here's the thing too, a lot of people worry about opponents or detractors or critics of the United Conservative Party are calling this worst case scenario for them because it may not be Jason Kenney that leads the Conservatives into the next election, but a new leader, whether that's current Finance Minister Travis Taves or Minister Rajan Sawhney or somebody else, perhaps a private industry person that comes in, someone with a bit of a name behind them, maybe Michelle Rempel-Garner, the MP out of Calgary, someone like that the message could be, listen, let's not burn this thing down. We've brought these two parties together. We're on the right track. The economy's recovering. We're taking seriously investments in things like hydrogen and solar farms, and Edmonton and Greater Edmonton is quickly becoming the AI, the artificial intelligence capital of Canada, one of the global centers of research, et cetera, et cetera. And with that type of messaging, I think people could go, well, yeah, I mean, it does seem a little premature. It does seem a bit of a self-inflicted wound to just, blow up this party before it has a chance to have a second term. Every party maybe deserves a second term. And I bet you that you could convince people of that. And I think that if Jason Kenney, even himself, sticks around, he's got time to rehabilitate his image. I mean, you mentioned Doug Ford, he managed to do it with kind of this aw shucks routine of his. You wonder what Jason Kenney, what cosplay he might participate in next.
Jason Kenney blamed his downfall on crazy, marginal, fringe people that were not reasonable, couldn't be reasoned with. You've been hosting an open line talk show for a long time. So you know that this is not a recent phenomenon, that there are people out there who have unusual views or extreme views. Not a new phenomenon at all. Why was it not apparently a factor when Peter Lougheed was the premier and the PCs appeared like a very reasonable centrist political party? And why is it a much bigger factor in Alberta politics now? People have always been there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a fair question. You see it as well. I mean, if you want to take a look at sort of the extreme perspectives on different ends of the political spectrum, Rachel Notley faces a lot of criticism from the legit hardcore federal NDP supporter that would describe her, and quite rightfully, as almost a small C conservative premier. I mean, she's probably the least NDP-esque. She's NDP light to a lot of people who don't believe that she, that they didn't like her support of pipelines. They didn't like her alliance with Justin Trudeau and the Liberals on energy development, all that kind of stuff. So she faces that from her own faction there, that she didn't do enough with AISH, with the assured income for the severely handicapped, like social supports and services, stuff like that. And then of course, on the conservative side as well, I don't know if it's is it more of a factor now? Are people just better at organizing? Or the social issues more important to people? Things that the general public demanding more action on things, people want to know. Just the other day, let me say just the other week with the, Justice Alito's sort of leaked or released, paper indicating that the Supreme Court down in the States is looking at reversing Roe v. Wade. And, reporters wanted to ask, provincial premiers. They wanted to ask mayors for that matter. They don't care what level the elected office is. They want to know, what's your perspective on things like that? What's your perspective on a woman's right on women's health options? What's your take on things like environmental sustainability, reconciliation, apologies for residential schools? They want to know. They don't care if it's, they want to get into the weeds on jurisdictions or whose problem it is, or, they want to get into some fight like at the Coots border blockade during this truck convoy, Jason Kenney saying, hey, listen, that's federal land. That's not our problem. And the prime minister saying, well, that's, as far as we can tell, that's Alberta right there. That, there's all these kind of dodging these bullets. Right. And I don't know, maybe it's just more relevant right now that people expect political leaders to take strong stands on these issues around so-called social justice. And it was interesting. And I thought it was telling when Jason Kenney was asked a couple of weeks ago about this, about what he made of this SCOTUS story and what he made of Roe v. Wade and how that applies to, will he as premier ensure that people in Alberta, have access, to health options regardless of who they are, their background, whatever. And his thing was, I'm not going to comment on nor meddle in a decision from a foreign court. That's not my role. That's not my place. Essentially, I'm going to stay in my lane.
It's not an answer that works. It's not an answer.
People are sitting there going, you called I don't remember the word off the top of my head. One of your audience members can tweet it at us when they hear this. But what would he call the governor of Michigan? Like not a buffoon or something, but for her position on Line 5 on that pipeline through Michigan. I mean, he's like, what did he like when Joe Biden was sworn in the day of his inauguration as president of the United States? Jason Kenney was banging the drum, talking about basically what an idiot the new president of the United States was for pulling the presidential privilege and shutting down Keystone XL. I mean, like it's so funny how he thinks, Jason Kenney, that he can pick and choose what he's going to comment on, what he's going to take a strong and bold position on from the position, the pulpit of the Premier of Alberta, and where he's not obligated to answer to anybody. Anyway, I'm kind of dancing around the question you asked me and not really answering it, but I just think this is a guy that's been, I don't know why I'm thinking of Tom Hanks in Big. You remember when he's jumping on the big piano and he's trying to jump on the different keys, and it seems like that's what Kenny's been. He's been trying to hit
one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, it's an amazing movie, and he's been trying to hit all the right notes and play all the right notes, and it just gets difficult. But you alienate a big group of people, like we said. I mean, when this party was being formed 5 years ago now, hard to believe. But people were saying at these campaign stops or at these events or the votes where it mattered most, there'd be these buses that would show up of young organizers and young conservatives from, people are saying, well, they're all from Bible colleges. Or I don't know if you can paint them with that brush, all of them, but they'd be promised like pizza and whatever to show up and mobilize and organize and do this type of thing. And that's where they found a lot of their support in bringing this party together and helping him win those two leadership battles and ultimately win the election. And he pissed a lot of those people off, not just with the Eastern Slope stuff. I'm talking more about with the COVID stuff, and not in the right way. I mean, these are the people that were bitter at him. I don't think that his 51.4% is an indictment of just how he handled COVID. I think it's an indictment of a lot of things, including leadership style and tone and how he's run his government. How he behaves to the general public, how he comes across. But I think that COVID probably played a big role in losing the support of a big part of his base. Like David, his chief of staff left her office, they say without pay, who cares? I doubt it. I'm sure that someone was greasing her wheels. That doesn't matter. But the point is, when the premier of the province, the chief of staff leaves for 4, 6, 8 weeks to work on his leadership campaign, his leadership review campaign, like, who's behind the controls in the premier's office? Like, is this good for Alberta? It says a lot. And then to still emerge with just over 51%, oy vey.
All right. So let's just veer off politics for a second before we have to wrap up. And just talk to me about the province a little bit. I mean, I'm really interested. I talk to people a lot on this show about climate change and about the energy transition. And I'm, I think a little bit more sensitive than some people in the country are about what the impacts of this are on Alberta. And, but I'm interested in your take on what it does to the psychology of the province, if anything. Does the looming energy transition and the issue of climate change create some sense of overhanging foreboding or pessimism or fear of the future in Alberta?
Well, yes, and no. And the yes, I think, is from people who I have a great degree of empathy for, who have spent a large part of their career in oil and gas and have accomplished remarkable things. I mean, the innovation on display in Alberta with Alberta's oil sands and fracking and some of the more unpopular stuff that's also driven the economy of this country and fueled and heated this nation has been really remarkable. The innovation out of the universities of Calgary and Alberta and elsewhere, Athabasca University, has really established this as the energy capital of Canada, obviously North America, maybe, and elsewhere. And so, like, yes, when the price of oil drops and when energy suffers and when there's economic downturn, you see it in Calgary's downtown when the lights turn off more than you see it, for example, in Edmonton's downtown. You really feel it in Calgary's downtown. There's also a sense of optimism that Alberta can continue to be the energy capital of Canada if this transition is managed smartly and smoothly. And this is one of the big reasons why I think that Albertans, many of them, have taken a great degree of issue with, significant cuts to research budgets at universities, in particular at the University of Alberta. A lot of people are really upset, by the way, at how the newly minted president at the University of Alberta has many people believe kind of bent over backwards for the premier and carried some water for him. That's an interesting story to monitor. But there's a lot of other innovation happening, and I think that people need to be convinced that, number one, the government is making smart decisions. It's interesting. Jason Kenney likes to invoke the word ideological to describe Rachel Notley's NDP, but I'm not sure that there's been a premier in Alberta's history, maybe Bible Bill Aberhart, but that's been more ideologically driven than Jason Kenney. And a big part of that is with his pals in oil and gas. They got him there, and they're powerful, and there's no doubt about that. And there's no doubt that oil and gas is important to Alberta, but people want to believe that, listen, if there is a future in geothermal or in hydrogen or in nuclear, whatever conversation you want to have, wind in southern Alberta, solar in some parts of the province, is this province ideologically open-minded, intuitive, intelligent, and maybe even a little bit humble enough to really open itself up to thrive there and to succeed there. We have a skilled and talented workforce, many of them young people with families that want to stay living here. They like that you can buy a single detached house in Edmonton for $375,000 or $400,000. They like that they can, get a house with a backyard that their kids can play, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot. They like that they're 45 minutes in Calgary from the Rocky Mountains. They want to stay here, but they want to see that opportunity. I mean, I had an interesting show just today, Real Talk today, like hours before I talked to you. Two of my guests. Number one, hydrogen and fuel cell guy. He was talking about how he said Alberta has to be Kodak, has to be Fuji, not Kodak. And he talked about the advent of digital photography and how Kodak was asleep at the switch and lost an enormous amount of market share and ultimately drove itself into the ditch. Whereas Fuji saw an opportunity to take expertise with its engineers and its designers. It got into things like pharmaceuticals. I mean, things that were way outside camera film. And now Fuji remains a massive brand in the world. And that requires the ability to pivot and to see things coming and to know what direction to take it. And I also talked to Enoch Cree Nation Chief Billy Morin, the former Grand Chief of Treaty 6, a young guy, like really impressive guy, ardent conservative, which you don't really, I mean, he endorsed Pierre Poilievre, so he's really in a really interesting position. And of course, I talked to him about pipeline development and environmental consultation with First Nations, and how his perspective might align with or conflict with, clash with some of his fellow First Nations leadership, in particular on the West Coast. And he people can find it on my Twitter. He had an interesting comment where he said, he's talked to chiefs along the West Coast, and they said, listen, they said to him, we don't want what happened to your buffalo to happen to our salmon. And he said, as a strong pipeline supporter, that gave him pause. And that's something that he's been trying to wrap his mind around. You can tell that comment impacted him because there's also Enoch Cree Nation is a really forward-thinking, really ambitious community. I mean, if you look at this First Nation, what they've done, they literally share, the city of Edmonton and Enoch Cree Nation is separated by a road with a Costco on it. Like they're right there. And they've got a magnificent resort out there, a huge casino and entertainment venue. I interviewed Jay Leno over there. They bring in all the big names, NHL-sized ice rink. At least the ice surface is NHL-sized, et cetera, et cetera. They're doing a lot. These First Nations partnerships, they're investing in things like carbon sequestration, carbon capture. So this isn't some guy that's like, hell no, you're not running a pipeline through our land. He would welcome I remember talking to Chief Morin when he first got elected, not first, but you remember the prominent, obviously, railway blockades a few years ago across the country. And I said to him, as an Indigenous, as a First Nations elected chief, what's your perspective on this? And he said, I think it's time we buy the railroad. Like, that's how this guy's mind works. Very big thinker. And so that was a telling conversation too. So it's a nuanced conversation. I do think that obviously people get touchy. Nobody seemed to care in Alberta when Stephen Harper acknowledged that, we won't be using fossil fuels forever. He gave a 100-year timeline, which maybe eased the blow for some people. But when Justin Trudeau mentions it, the obvious that, it's not going to happen forever, people take it as some sort of a personal slight, like Trudeau hates Alberta. And that for me, just as someone who I endeavor to have reasonable and informed and open-minded public conversations, that one's always kind of, bugged me a little bit. I think it's a disingenuous comment for a guy that, bought a pipeline to keep it alive, the TMX, and, on its way to Burnaby. And yeah, so it's an ongoing conversation for sure. I think that the next premier of Alberta is going to have to, whether it's Rachel Notley, Jason Kenney, somebody else, it's going to have to be somebody that understands how to find that balanced perspective, because you can't take a big dump on oil and gas, that's for sure. But you also don't want to build your house on it.
So you see all the federal cabinet ministers come through Alberta whenever they come through, and you would observe them. Do you notice anybody you think stands out in their ability to talk to Albertans about this in a way that Albertans can understand? Is there a person who's particularly adept at communicating to Albertans?
I think it's a tough crowd. It's a really tough crowd, and I think that there are some federal ministers that are. Chrystia Freeland, for example, the finance minister, deputy PM, like she's from Fairview, Alberta. Fairview, Alberta graduated Chrystia Freeland and Jordan Peterson. Like pretty interesting case studies.
I didn't know
there.
that.
Yeah. But I wonder if she'll be on his podcast anytime soon. I don't know. But she comes through and, she's impressive, doesn't kind of get a lot of, she doesn't get the credit of an Alberta girl, right? It's not like she doesn't come in wearing her cowboy boots and her hat. She doesn't come in sort of patronizing in that way, but she's proud to be from here. I bet you the average Albertan, or at least the average critic of hers from Alberta, probably doesn't realize that she has Alberta roots. I've been impressed with, Seamus O'Regan. I had a really interesting conversation with him just the day after.
So did I. Yeah.
He's a smart guy and obviously good with people, right? Former national broadcaster, he knows what he's doing. But he had an interesting meeting with Alberta's energy minister, Sonia Savage, and I asked him about it, and I sort of was, I guess in a way, not trying to pin him down, but I figured he'd be a candid guy if anybody would. And I said, so how would you describe this relationship between the federal government and the United Conservatives? He wouldn't bite. He said, I've got a great working relationship with Minister Savage, and we have some common priorities, and we're committed to helping Alberta. And I was pretty impressed with that interview. And when we had him on, downloads wide, it landed pretty well for us. And so I'd give him credit for that. I've been impressed with Minister Jonathan Wilkinson on the show. And but yeah, it's some of these ones land with a thud as well. And these are hardworking MPs and hardworking ministers, but cold shoulder type receptions. I've witnessed them personally. I host a lot of events professionally, and I introduce different levels of government and the VIPs and these types of things. And you get raucous applause for some, and some of them get the real cold shoulder. And I've seen that more than one time, and it's always a little bit awkward.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, Ryan, an hour just flies by. Awesome conversation. Thank you for coming on. My listeners will have a much, much greater appreciation for the complexities of Alberta. And it is a very complex place. I think often around the country it gets caricatured and is seen as a simplistic place, but it's actually a large, growing, and increasingly complex place, especially politically. Thanks for coming on to explain it. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, and our sponsor, CN Rail, for their help in putting this show on. And everybody for listening. Thanks for being here, and we will see you next week.